There is a YouTube channel called CollegeHumor. It is devoted to uploading quick little satires, often lampooning popular culture and trends. In fact, the channel is responsible for two of my favourite YouTube videos. We Didn't Start the Flame War.
We didn't start the flame war. Keeps her hating on it for a landmark comment. We didn't start the flame war. Let the whole wide world know I'm a big old asshole.
And GoldenEye Standoff.
Is that the best you've got, Trevelyan?
You'll never get out of this facility alive, Bond.
Sorry, Alec. I've got other plans. Ah!
Tables turn rather quickly, don't they?
Have you completely lost your mind? We both agreed you couldn't use our job. He's too short, he's impossible to shoot.
Is it really so hard to look down, James?
One of the shows available on this channel is a series of quick little videos hosted by Adam Conover, called Adam Ruins Everything, which has since evolved into its own television series. The series aims to debunk common misconceptions in everyday life that have generally been assumed as factual, and doing so in a satirical manner. However, this series is far from having a spotless record. A quick Google search shows that a few episodes have received their fair share of valid criticism. Chief among them, his episode implying that alpha males do not exist has been debunked by many sources, and the episode Adam Ruins Going Green was criticised by Verge writer Sean O'Keefe. He showed that Conover had misrepresented the information regarding electric cars published in Slate magazine, and that his argument was based on many flawed assumptions. Conover argued that switching over to electric cars would actually increase the carbon footprint because electric vehicles would pull power from a coal-driven power plant. But, as O'Keefe points out, this assumes the power plant is running off coal. Some cities use solar power plants or wind farms, because coal as a fuel source has been on the decline in recent years. Conover responded to this criticism in a so-called correction segment, but for the most part, he instead just danced around the bulk of O'Keefe's criticism and attributed his errors to not explaining his argument better. It's not a matter of explaining the argument better, it's a simple matter of the argument being based on lazy research. And here's another example of lazy research. As much as I hate to say it, even Conover's episode attempting to debunk Donald Trump's preposterous idea of building a wall along the US-Mexico border has received valid criticism. For example, he argued that just building the wall would be way too expensive.
Just building the wall would cost between $15 and $25 billion.
¡Ay, el duende tiene magia demónica!
It would easily be one of the single most expensive pieces of infrastructure in American history, costing as much as 20 Hoover dams or NASA's entire annual budget.
That's one small step for man. One giant wall for no reason.
Yes, he actually had footage of an astronaut on the moon bumping into the wall. This Apollo reference makes his argument very misleading. The Apollo program was not paid for in one go, it was paid over a 14-year period between 1961 and 1975, culminating with the Apollo-Soyuz test project, meaning that they had 14 years of annual budgets to play with. The Apollo program cost about $200 billion in modern currency, far in excess of the $25 billion figure that he quotes for Trump's wall. Now, $15 to $25 billion may sound like an insurmountable price tag, but it's actually rather small when you consider what NASA's annual budget actually amounts to. NASA's current annual budget is just under $18 billion a year. By comparison, the annual budget of the entire US military is nearly $600 billion a year. That's enough to pay for 2 Apollo programs and still have enough money left over to pay for at least 8 walls. And speaking of the Apollo program, with the release of one of his most recent episodes entitled Adam Ruins Conspiracy Theories, Conover has gained yet another critic. Honestly, I shouldn't even be bothering with this episode, because content-wise, the episode has very little about Apollo that I haven't already discussed in previous episodes. In fact, in the entire episode, he only talks about Apollo for about 5 minutes. The remaining 20 minutes are irrelevant tangents about the satanic panic in California during the 1980s, followed by poisoning the well by associating all conspiracy theories in general with cognitive dysfunction. The moon landing section of the episode was published on CollegeHumor's YouTube channel as part of its Adam Ruins Everything playlist. I've already left a comment debunking what was said in that clip. Ironically, the clip is categorized as comedy, but sadly, this crap is taken seriously. For that reason, and the fact that I've received quite a few requests to debunk this episode, I feel compelled to devote a MoonFaker episode to Conover's nonsense. Right off the bat, I'm going to skip past most of Conover's relevant tangents and forced overacting, and instead leave only the bits where he gets right to the point. Partly to avoid a copyright strike, but mainly for the sanity of my viewers who can tell the difference between entertainment and science.
Actually, creating that lighting would have been essentially impossible in a studio.
Melinda, meet Mark Shubin. He's a forensic motion picture analyst and an Emmy-winning Life Fellow of the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers.
Thanks, Adam. Using image forensics, I can tell you that the light source we see in the moon footage is actually parallel sun rays with no diffusion. If you look at the photos from the Apollo mission, you can see that all the shadows are parallel because the light source is 93 million miles away.
You call that parallel? You can see the shadows cast by the lemon flag diverging away from the foreground shadows. Why did you not draw lines along the shadows in the background?
But if you try to recreate that same photo using studio lighting, the shadows diverge.
Oh, you mean like your own photo that you cherry-picked? And how about this example from Apollo 14? You can see the shadows are diverging away. Some have claimed that this is due to the terrain. However, you can clearly see the shadows cast by these rocks in the background on the same level terrain as the LEM are diverging off in the same direction as the foreground shadows. Hell, David Percy cited this very photo as evidence that a close and very large light source was used.
This is the designated landing site of Apollo 14. The area where the LEM is located is virtually flat. But one can calculate from the diverging shadows that the source of the illumination is within the area of the scene itself, apparently overhead. In other words, it cannot be the sun. It's possible to work out exactly where the light source was positioned, because the shadows diverge from a point here, when in fact the shadows ought to be parallel. The sun creates parallel shadows. The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadow here. When natural sunlight is illuminating objects on flat terrain, this result is impossible, but this result is consistent with illumination from a closely positioned artificial source of light.
Conover then gets to the sole crux of his argument.
Back in the 60s, the only way to recreate that effect would be to build a wall of millions of laser lights so close together they'd be like pixels on a TV screen. But lasers back then were big and costly, so rigging together that many at that size would have required an enormous apparatus that probably would have cost more than the entire Apollo project. And in those days, the only lasers that were practically available were red. Which means the color photos we have from the moon landing would have been impossible. Now today, we could recreate the correct lighting with computer graphics. But in 1969, those didn't exist. I've asked my colleagues in forensics and in movie production, and given the parallel light rays and the detailed color photos, we just cannot think of any way they could have faked the moon landing with the technology they had at the time.
This is both nonsensical and a complete fallacy of necessity. The logical fallacy in which an unwarranted degree of necessity is placed in the conclusion. It is also a fallacy of omission. Here's how HBO simulated the sunlight when they did their 1999 miniseries From the Earth to the Moon, without a wall of millions of laser lights, and without CGI.
Well, when I first saw the moonscape, I guess my reaction was, this should work.
Our director of photography, Gail Tattersall, has created an amazing sun effect, which is really what sells this as being real.
The solution turned out to be using a convex mirror about 6 feet in diameter, and then projecting into it the most powerful spotlights that are available in the film business today, which are 10K xenons. There were only 15, I believe, in the United States, and we had to have 5 made extra just to be able to get our brightness level up to being able to record on film.
I would say the light that we have created to simulate the sun on the moon is probably one of the single brightest light sources ever created for anything.
As you can see, no lasers, no CGI, just a series of extremely powerful xenon spotlights shining into a convex mirror that then reflects the light onto a gigantic moon set. hardly outside the realm of 1960s technology. Hell, the US military, for example, used xenon lights on their tanks as searchlights during the Vietnam War, which coincided with the Apollo program. According to this February 1968 Popular Science article, published 16 months before Apollo 11, we are told, "The secret of the new searchlights, made by electro-optical systems, is compact xenon arc lamps consisting of thoriated tungsten electrodes inside a quartz envelope pressurized with xenon gas. Extremely high arc current, passing through a gap measured in millimeters, changes the xenon to a brilliantly luminous plasma with qualities close to sunlight." And that, my friends, is just one of these arc lamps. Now suppose we have an entire array of them. Oh, and look at this! Parallel shadows! Wow, I guess this must be on the moon.
I've asked my colleagues in forensics and in movie production, and given the parallel light rays and the detailed color photos, we just cannot think of any way they could have faked the moon landing with the technology they had at the time.
And just who are Shubin's colleagues in forensics and movie production who claim they couldn't think of a way to fake the lighting with 1960s technology? Name one of those who claimed the lighting was impossible. If anything, the record clearly shows that simulating the sunlight in the 1960s was possible. From my chair, I have to say that this is false attribution, the logical fallacy of appealing to an unsubstantiated, unnamed, or even fabricated source in support of an argument. It's just priceless how many propagandists love attributing their own foibles to their opponents. In this case, accusing opponents of making logical fallacies, but having no qualms of using them themselves. I wanted to contact Mark Shubin to ask how he reconciled his statements in light of this information, but he couldn't be reached for comments. And that, my friends, is Conover's entire segment. That's the only original thing he had to say along these lines, and it is clearly based on flawed assumptions, omissions, and is completely unnecessary. The remainder of this video is the usual easily debunked claims that you can lift from any propagandist website.
Well, then an astronomical number of people would have had to keep that secret, like over 400,000 NASA employees.
Firstly, the only people who need to be in the know are those actually faking it and the most higher-ups at NASA. The rest need not know. The Mission Control Center technicians were fed data over the landlines from the Manned Spaceflight Network, or MISFIN, and make decisions based on the readouts. They don't need to know or care where the data came from. For training purposes, the MCC technicians were sent simulated data over the landlines, rather than actual flight data. Therefore, there is an argument to be made that the technicians could be fooled by simulated data, and thus need not be in on the conspiracy. In fact, many MCC technicians, including Flight Director Gene Kranz, has described the simulations as being indistinguishable from the actual mission.
The simulations were so real that no controller could discern the difference between the training and the real mission.
And secondly, if you want a historical example of thousands of people being kept quiet for decades, look no further than the Soviet equivalent to the Apollo program. The N1L3 program involved literally thousands of Soviet scientists and engineers. And the failed test launches of the N1 were a state secret until the fall of the USSR. In fact, the details of this program were not made public until the USSR collapsed. But perhaps the biggest irony here is the fact that Conover is full aware of this cover-up. Later in the same episode, Conover cites a December 18, 1969 New York Times article by John Noble Wilford. This article, titled "Russians Finally Admit They Lost a Race to the Moon," covers the Soviet Union's official disclosure of the N1 project. The article discusses in explicit detail how the Soviets covered up the existence of the entire program. So for Conover to go through all this bullshit and forced overacting, alleging that thousands of people cannot keep a government secret for decades, is essentially a lie. Adam Conover is a liar. Everything he has said so far in this episode is a lie. He lied about the direction of the shadows, he lied about the requirements for simulating sunlight on the moon, and in the same sentence, claimed that thousands of people cannot keep a secret for decades while simultaneously citing a reference that they can. Seriously, did Conover even read this article? Did he think none of his viewers would do a quick Google search on his references? This is like standing in front of a white background and claiming that it is black.
Scientists from Australia, Spain, and England who said they independently picked up the moon landing transmission from space.
Firstly, Australia and Spain are not independent. The Madrid Deep Space Communications Complex is part of NASA's Deep Space Network, as is Honeysuckle Creek and Tidbin Billa in Australia. Parkes and the others were part of NASA's manned spaceflight network.
Well, NASA has installed here at the Parkes radio telescope the specialized equipment to receive the unique signals from the Apollo 11 spacecraft. The manned spaceflight network consists of 22 stations, of which 18 are land stations, 4 are ships. Parkes has been given the honorary title of the 23rd tracking station in the manned spaceflight network. As such, since Parkes has only a receive capability, it is considered an auxiliary antenna to the Honeysuckle Creek tracking station, and all of the telemetry, voice, and biomedical data is routed via microwave to the Honeysuckle Creek station, where it is interfaced with their computer and then routed to the manned spacecraft control center at Houston, Texas.
These facilities were run by NASA contractors and NASA employees. I'd hardly call that independent. Even to this day, that's still how these Australian facilities operate. I mean, I've lost count of how many times Glenn Nagle from the Canberra Deep Space Communications Complex has been dubbed by the media as NASA's man down under.
Glenn Nagle from NASA's tracking station in Australia.
From the NASA tracking station in Canberra, of course, is Mr. Glenn Nagle. Welcome back, Glenn. How are you?
So I caught up with NASA's man down under, Glenn Nagle, to find out about some of our great achievements, which include everything from Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon to the current Phoenix mission on Mars. This facility is one of 3 in the world that make up NASA's Deep Space Network.
To have a network that can provide communication to all the spacecraft anywhere in the solar system, you need them separated by about 1/3 of the world each. So a good 120 degrees line either side runs nicely through Australia. Ended up being the best spot.
Now this dish is probably the most famous here, is it?
Yeah, this is the dish originally from Honeysuckle Creek that actually returned the very first images of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the surface of the moon way back in July 1969.
Where the hell did the idea come from that the Australian and Madrid tracking stations were independent from NASA? Does no one understand the definition of independent anymore? And if that's not enough, once again, Conover shoots himself in the foot with his own reference. He cites an interview with Valerino Claro Jarrah, the former operations and communications supervisor at the Maspalomas tracking station in Spain, which was also part of NASA's manned spaceflight network. The interview says this repeatedly. I think you can see where this is going. Nowhere does this interview imply or even suggest that the Maspalomas tracking station was independent from NASA. In fact, it explicitly states the exact opposite. Claro Jarrah even explicitly states that he was a contract employee for NASA, and that during the Apollo 11 mission, the Misfin station at Maspalomas was acting as a backup to another NASA Misfin station in Spain. And Conover claims these Spanish scientists tracked Apollo independently? Bullshit! If you tried to pull this fast one in front of a judge, the judge would cut your balls off, and rightfully so. As for England, Jodrell Bank is indeed independent from NASA, and they report that they detected signals from Apollo, albeit only in lunar proximity. However, they also reported to have detected the voices of Popovich and Sevastyanov coming from the Zonda 5 spacecraft as it circled the moon in September 1968. At face value, that may appear to prove that the Russians sent cosmonauts around the moon. But guess what? The Zonda 5 was unmanned. It was revealed that the Russians simply sent an unmanned Soyuz around the moon, and the cosmonauts transmitted their voices from Crimea and Ukraine to the spacecraft, which in turn relayed the signals. According to Eugene Cernan, pre-recorded messages were also used. As he put it, a few months later, Zonda 5 carried another unmanned Soyuz spacecraft around the far side of the moon, and the voice of a cosmonaut was heard sending back computer readings. It was only a tape recording, but it had shocked the hell out of us. The book, The First Soviet Cosmonaut Team, by Burgess and Hall, includes Popovich's own account of the event. When we realized we would never make it to the moon, we decided to engage in a little bit of hooliganism. We asked our engineers to link the on-the-probe receiver to the transmitter with a jumper wire. Moonflight missions were controlled from a command center in Yevpatoria in Crimea. When the Zond 5 probe was on its path around the moon, I was at the center, so I took the mic and said, "The flight is proceeding according to normal. We're approaching the surface." Seconds later, my report, as if from outer space, was received on Earth, including the Americans. The US space advisor Frank Borman got a phone call from President Nixon who asked, "Why is Popovich reporting from the moon?" My joke caused real turmoil. In about a month's time, Frank came to the USSR and I was instructed to meet him at the airport. Hardly had he walked out of his plane when he shook his fist at me and said, "Hey, you space hooligan." It should be clear that many in the West initially thought the spacecraft was manned, but it was officially revealed not to be the case. So, picking up transmissions doesn't prove that NASA sent manned missions to the moon. All that would be needed to full independence would be an American equivalent to Zond 5.
And the Russians, our space race rivals, who had every reason to prove us wrong.
It's been 50 years and we haven't even claimed that you faked it. You beat us fair and square this time, but we'll get you back in 2016.
We just saw how the Russians initially duped the world with Zond 5. The only way they could prove us wrong would be to cry foul on the radiation hazard. You know, the same radiation hazard that they told Savannah Lavelle about in 1963, the reason why they were postponing manned moon missions indefinitely until it could be solved? Of course, revealing that the radiation was too hazardous would also be detrimental to them. Suppose they blew the whistle on NASA and then decided to dupe the world with another Zond 5. Who would believe them when they previously declared that the radiations made the Apollo missions impossible? And as far as rivals go, the US had been selling wheat to the USSR during the Kennedy administration through to the early 70s.
American wheat for grain-short Russia is announced in one of the most potentially controversial moves of the Kennedy administration. Economically, it figures the United States has about 1 billion bushels of surplus grain, while Soviet crops were down 18% this year. 150 million bushels to be sold will help our agricultural economy, and the proponents of the sale say promote peace. This sale could lead to further agreements with other nations in the Soviet bloc.
And since 1975, the US and Russians have officially become space collaborators on various joint space missions, ASTP, Mir, the ISS, and various others. The US pays Russia for astronaut rides aboard the Soyuz. What would Russia have to gain from blowing the whistle on NASA?
But where's the tangible proof that we went to the moon, huh? There isn't any.
Actually, there is. While the astronauts were on the moon, they laid out a reflective material called retroreflectors. So today, when an observatory on Earth aims a high-powered laser at them, it bounces right back.
So do you think the Russians landed men on the moon? The Lunokhod 1 and 2 deployed retroreflectors without the help of humans aboard. These rovers were completely unmanned. And again, Conover's own reference even states this. In addition, a second pair were built by French scientists and were flown to the moon by the Soviet Union on their robot lunar probes. So he has no excuse for trying to pass this off as, quote, tangible evidence that man went to the moon. Nor does he have any excuse for claiming that we need to, as his girlfriend character puts it,
somehow get retroreflectors to the moon without actually going there.
It's been done!
And if you are going to go through all the trouble of pulling an American Zond 5 on the world, why not have said relay mission also deploy a retroreflector? And that, my friends, is all Conover had to say on Apollo. As I said before, he goes off on tangents regarding the Satanic Panic, arguing that conspiracy theories are hurtful to people. I guess we're supposed to see some kind of parallels between the Apollo hoax movement and the satanic accusations that resulted in false arrests of preschool teachers. Right. Tell me, how many people have been arrested or trialed as a result of the Apollo hoax movement? The only trial that comes to mind is the Jim Lavelle versus Bill Casing trial, and that was purely a libel suit. If anyone was hurt from the Apollo hoax, it would have to be those on the inside who dared speak out, like Thomas Ronald Barron of North American Aviation, who lost his job for leaking his criticisms of the Apollo program to the press, and then after testifying regarding the Apollo 1 fire, was killed along with his family when his car was hit by a train. Or how about Gus Grissom, NASA's key candidate to be the first man on the moon? He hung a lemon on the Apollo capsule, voiced his lack of confidence in the Apollo program to the press, and then was burnt to death in the Apollo 1 fire along with Edward White and Roger Chaffee. The episode then trails off into poisoning the well, by associating conspiracy theories in general with cognitive mistakes and cognitive bias, or as he calls it, the human brain's faulty wiring.
I'm just too skeptical and rational to believe it.
No, you don't believe it because you're just the victim of the human brain's faulty wiring. And that's what makes everyone susceptible to conspiracy theories, even you. Conspiracy theories feel like they're rational, but that's because our brains are hardwired in a way that causes us to make cognitive mistakes. Humans are generally very good at understanding the world around us. We look for cause and effect. We seek out patterns, and we ask why events happened and who caused them. But those same impulses are also subject to cognitive biases that can cause us to come up with incorrect theories about the world.
Yeah, screw what witnesses have to say, screw what the data suggests, screw any evidence of a conspiracy. It's all a matter of cognitive dysfunction because reasons. Ironically, in his attempt to poison the well, Adam Conover shed some light on who's really cognitively challenged.
And that's why conspiracy theories tend to form around large, terrifying tragedies. For example, when JFK was assassinated, it was such a random and horrific event, people couldn't believe it was the work of just one man.
The president was killed? It couldn't have been just one crazy guy. There must be more to it.
But when Ronald Reagan was shot, there were no prominent conspiracy theories. Why? Because Reagan didn't die. This made the event less shocking, which made it easier to accept the consensus explanation. Proportionality bias in action.
Yes, he actually said that. I am not kidding. There is a very straightforward and compelling reason why no one believed that the failed Reagan assassination was a conspiracy, and it has nothing to do with the fact that Reagan survived. The gunman was within 2 meters when he pulled the trigger, and did so in full view of the press, who had television cameras rolling. It's kind of hard to doubt who did the crime when you have it caught on camera. Likewise, nobody doubts who killed Lee Harvey Oswald because his assassination by Jack Ruby was broadcast on live television, again in full view of the cameras.
There is Lee. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
JFK, on the other hand, was shot at by a sniper, or snipers. By definition, a sniper is a gunman who shoots from a hiding place, usually by putting distance and altitude between himself and his target, and thus the assassin, or assassins, did the crime out of view of the press. Kind of leaves it open to interpretation, doesn't it? And conspiracy theories involving the JFK assassination stem largely from witnesses who reported hearing gunshots from locations other than the book depository, including Ellie Connolly, who was adamant to her death that her husband was shot by a bullet separate to the two that hit Kennedy, thus contradicting the Warren Commission's findings. Not to mention the inability to accurately recreate the multiple wounds that have been attributed to a single bullet. And to put that into perspective, Traffic Games released JFK Reloaded for Windows in 2004. The game tasks the player with recreating Oswald's 3 shots with 100% accuracy. This game was intended as a means of debunking JFK conspiracy theories. However, the developers programmed the game with unrealistic ballistics to make it easier for players to win. When you have to alter the game's physics to prove your point, you know you're in trouble. And ironically enough, just weeks after this episode of Adam Ruins Everything was aired, the Trump White House suppressed the release of classified documents concerning the Kennedy assassination. If Conover cannot even get right something as simple as why no one doubted the official story concerning the Reagan assassination attempt, I cannot imagine why anyone should take him seriously again. The only thing he has ruined is his credibility. Now, I know what you're thinking. He's just a comedian. He's trying to do observational humor. There's nothing wrong with observational humor. George Carlin, for example, was a huge hit for his crude yet satirical attacks on politics, religion, corporations, and almost everything in everyday life.
And secondly, I don't vote because I believe if you vote, you have no right to complain. People like to twist that around, I know. They say, well, if you don't vote, you have no right to complain. But where's the logic in that? If you vote, and you elect dishonest, incompetent people, and they get into office and screw everything up, well, you are responsible for what they have done. You caused the problem. You voted them in. You have no right to complain. I, on the other hand, who did not vote, who, in fact, did not even leave the house on election day, am in no way responsible for what these people have done and have every right to complain as loud as I want about the mess you created that I had nothing to do with.
We laughed at his jokes because they were both funny but true. However, when Adam Conover posts episodes like this, or that, or this, or that, it's no longer in the realm of observational humour. It's just downright blatantly false information dressed up as science and facts. Metaphorically speaking, Adam Conover is not George Carlin when he posts episodes like this. He is Bozo the Clown.